This is a Resonant Identity, and I'm Terence Waters. Welcome to episode 16, where this episode we're now going to be talking about boundaries and avoidance as it relates to our architecture of protecting our healthy engagement, protecting our energy wells, and ensuring that we have the amount of energy to being able to focus on the right things while also not expending it on the wrong things. So to start out this episode, what I want to do is really talk a little bit more about a narrative and just a metaphor to kind of put this into perspective. And we're going to call it today the two doors. So what I want you to do is think about this. You're standing in front of a wall and you have the ability of being able to select which door you want to go into. Door one simply shows you an option, which is opening your boundary set up in place. And the other one, which is a door, is actually a door that it remains closed because it's shut out of fear. Now, I really want you to understand this and think about it, because we now have two doors that lead us to another option of opportunity. But you're now seeing a little bit of a metaphor and understanding decisions made within our boundaries give us one option, and decisions that we avoid simply because we're not willing to go through them close off other options. This is not something we normally think about when we talk about personal boundaries. When we normally talk about boundaries, we talk about them in terms of what do I need to do to ensure that I'm protecting myself? How do I convey to others that the decision that I'm about to make is actually outside of my comfort zone and is not something that I want to engage with because of my boundaries? But then we also kind of think about it in terms of understanding, wait a minute, might I actually be setting boundaries that may be actually restricting my ability to make decisions that are aligned with who I want to become? That's what this episode is about. Understanding the difference between boundaries and avoidance, understanding when we are actually making a decision with one versus the other, and then understanding what we need to do to ensure that our personal boundaries are set appropriately so we're focusing on the right things, making correct decisions within our sphere of influence, and also ensuring that we do not avoid decisions that may impact our ability for personal and identity growth. So for this episode, this will be borrowing more information from my book, The Resonance Core Framework, from chapter 10, which is regarding boundaries and avoidance. We'll also be talking about several psychological and philosophical references as it relates to human development, cyberkinetics and feedback loops, the polyvagal theory and somatic experiencing, and understanding nonviolent communication as we work through understanding our boundaries as we communicate them out. You'll learn all this information and be able to look through this in the show notes, where we'll be keeping all of these sources for you, and are also found in our companion article and 7-day challenge on the resonantidentity.com. So now that you've seen this metaphor of two different doors that give you options for additional possibilities regarding your identity and your ability to grow in terms of your self-worth and your self-determination, I really want to explain specifically in the Resonance Core Framework how we see boundaries, which is expanding your idea of what they might be for just a little bit, but giving you more insight on what they are. So boundaries, what we do is we describe them as an architectural element of our identity, which is an intentional structure that you set to define how you engage with people, but not how you actually withdraw from situations either. Let me explain a little bit more what that means. So first off, what I want you to consider is how every single day you wake up and you have a certain amount of energy, depending on how well you slept, how well you've been eating, your actual physical and mental health, things like that. And based on how well you've been keeping up on your health, depending on exercise and all those things, you have a certain amount of energy that you're given every single time we wake up. We all know this because every single day we wake, we have differing levels of that energy. Some days we feel like we can take on the world, where some days we just willing to go through the extra mile and are able to get a lot of work done to being able to achieve our goals. But then there are just other days where we are so low, we just feel so tired, and we're just exhausted by the end of the week, or even during the week, which is even more scary, right? Especially when it happens like a Tuesday or Wednesday. But you just feel that fog. You just are really just wanting to stay in bed. You're not feeling like you want to do anything, and so on. And then you have varying degrees between all of those different things, depending on just how you're feeling for that day. I call that in the Resonance Core Framework an energy well, which is, if you think of it in terms of how much water we put into our well itself, you're only allowed to expend and put in so much water into that well that gives you the ability for the energy that is available to you in that given day. So you can picture your energy well just as a means for you to be able to withdraw or put in energy to being able to get what you want and making your decisions. Because what this does is it gives you a framework to being able to understand what your state of being is. This is very well known in the polyvagal theory and also the state of being idea, which is simply saying that sometimes we just make decisions on a whim. Sometimes it's much easier to be on autopilot and just feel like you're not going to be able to do anything. And we do that because that's a neurobiological perspective. We've already gone over things like the activation engine, understanding the dopamine, the threat response cycle, and so many of those other things. But what you'll find is a lot of your energy and your ability to be able to make decisions really depends on your health. It is a really big part of understanding what you're capable of. And if that part of you is not currently well in check, you may as well forget about trying to actually make a difference in the world because you're not going to be able to. Your energy wells are going to be low and low every single day if you're not taking those measures to make sure that you take care of yourself. And now it's beyond the scope of my podcast and the Resonance Core Framework to tell you what you should and should not do. And of course, I have to give you the disclaimer. This is your medical circumstances. Go to your doctor, talk to your psychiatrist, your therapist, and so on to get best measures. But really, the universal truths that we already know and we have been drilled into us since we were kids still apply. Getting enough sleep every night, ensuring that you balance your work life, ensuring that you're talking with other people about circumstances and issues you're experiencing with your physical, mental, and emotional health. Having a healthy set of social circles in your family, in your friends, in people that you care about, your spouse, and so on. And then also ensuring that you get plenty of exercise. 150 minutes of rigorous exercise a week in forms of walking, ensuring that you're swimming, strength training, things like that, depending on, of course, how physically or mentally able you're able to do so. But all of those things contribute to your energy well, how well you're eating, what you're doing every day, how much sunlight you're getting, taking breaks, doing things like that. Because if you're constantly being this person that's on edge, working 10 to 12 hours a day without really getting much of time for yourself or your kids, you're getting to that point where you're just simply running your energy well dry. And so every single day just feels like another chore. You're on a workhorse. There's nothing you can do about it. And unfortunately, sometimes that does happen, right? Sometimes it's outside of our control. But when those moments then eventually happen that we're able to bring that down, we then need to balance it to ensure that we're giving ourselves enough rest, allowing ourselves the ability to be grounded, use meditation, breathing techniques, walking outside, finding ways to being able to mix up the scene a little bit so that your energy wells can be restored, because you need that in order to being able to make decisions. And boundaries help us do that, because boundaries act simply as a means for us to being able to protect the drives and the things that we care about. And not necessarily just simply about our energy wells, that's a big part of it, but also in terms of our personal ethical and moral code. Not necessarily from guardrails, which we happen to adopt, but also understanding that there's a certain limit of the things that we're willing to do and not do, which protect our actual drives and our value virtue system. Because if you look at it in understanding, drives aren't necessarily just simply virtuous expressions of what it is we want to do. They are also filled with integrity, resonance, energy, direction, things that actually push us towards who we want to be, while also ensuring that we do not expend our energy unnecessarily on things that are not going to get us what we want. So trying to work through and make a political movement or something that is clearly outside of our sphere of influence. And maybe you have some people that you can get involved in your social circles to being able to make it happen. But the fact of the matter is, some of that is just a lot outside of our control. And then also, if we really think about it in terms of people, how we're willing to be treated, the respect that we're willing to give, the information that we're working with as it relates to our decisions and the people that are in our life. Sometimes also we need to set those limits based on how much we know we can handle social circles. I know for me, for example, I'm definitely an ambivert. I can really enjoy having those moments of a lot of burst of social energy, but then I also know that I can only handle it for so long. And then usually the next day, I'm just simply enjoying my introversion, working on projects or my podcast or writing or whatever makes me happy. And then also being willing to take time for myself to allow myself to rest, allow myself to enjoy some leisure activities. playing the piano. I do like to game every once in a while. Hey, I'm 42 years old. I don't care. It's something that I enjoy doing. I just don't indulge in those things. But I also create things as well because it's just things that I enjoy. These are things that bring down our stress, that bring down our cortisol levels, that also refill the energy well, because there are things that we just enjoy doing as part of life. And then we're also talking about the EROI circumstances. So when we start experiencing our MBDs and our SMART goals, understanding what it is that we need to accomplish, those EROI light cues and emotions naturally make us feel good. And as a result, it also brings down those stress levels because we experience those endorphins. We experience those highs, the natural highs that our brains produce. We experience those moments of accomplishment, confidence, joy, because we're the ones that are doing it, because we're the ones that are making those decisions. And then when you start to understand that those boundaries are must-haves, that those are things that you are not willing to, under any circumstances, forego, when you start to notice that there are things happening in life that are taking you away from those things that you enjoy, that's when you know you need to set a boundary. We talked about this earlier in terms of the differences between boundaries and guardrails. Guardrails are those external systems that we decide to either implore as part of who we or are set upon us by external systems of things that are just beyond our control. These are things applied externally that can be either chosen or simply placed on us without any choice. Boundaries, however, are internal. These are specific things that help us explain and protect us in terms of what we want to do in terms of our identity coherence, our drive system, our value virtue system, our ethical and moral codes, and so on. And while ethical and moral codes, for example, are guardrails, they also are personal boundaries. Because if we do look into trying to understand what actions we need or not take, that's where we can establish a boundary for ourselves and others to say, I'm not comfortable doing this, and here's why. Boundaries protect the person of who we are and the person of who we are becoming. And what it allows us the ability to do is protect our energy wells, our integrity, our direction, our energy, that vision that we have of who we want to become. Because we have what's called creative truth, which we'll talk about later in the outward reach. But to touch on it very quickly, it allows you to being able to express to other people your actual boundaries and the things of what it is you experience in terms of your truth and your resonance without getting any permission from anyone else whatsoever or even agreement. It may not make sense right now, but just know for this point, when you need to express a boundary to someone else, creative truth as part of the resonance core framework gives you that ability to say, no, I'm not going to do this, and here's why. And resilient alignment in touch with creative truth is also that means of saying, I am choosing my identity alignment over anything else. That empowers you to being able to say, yes, I'm fine with doing this, and here's why, or not. And personal boundaries, so long as they are set in the correct way, because we're now about to show you the other side of it, personal boundaries protect us. They protect us in ensuring that we're making the right decisions in line with who we are, and it ensures that we have those boundaries set so that way we know what we're going to accomplish and being okay with saying we're not going to be able to do everything in this life, and that's okay. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with Terence Waters. We'll be right back. This is The Resonant Identity, and I'm Terence Waters. Welcome back. So now that we talked about what boundaries are, personal boundaries that are healthy, protecting us, allowing us to be able to ensure we expend our energy the right ways, and having the courage to being able to tell ourselves and others when or when not to engage in something, we now need to talk about the opposite end of the spectrum, which is what is called avoidance. Now, boundaries themselves are rooted in truth. They are rooted in who we are. They are rooted in resonance because we understand that this is an actual boundary that we should not cross to protect our identity coherence. Avoidance, on the other hand, though, is usually shrouded in distortion. We may make a decision that says that we are protecting a personal boundary by not engaging in something. But if we haven't fully explored our boundaries, avoidance, unfortunately, is the exact opposite of what actually happens with one. Because avoidance means that we are simply avoiding making a decision based on our fears, our guilt, our shame, our shadow cues, our tightening, our past identity. These are actions that are a somatic reflex, usually in the form of fears and reactivity, rather than understanding it as a conscious decision. And most of the time, avoidance, especially when it involves identity-aligned choices, actually shroud us in distortion and push us away from identity coherence. What that means is if you happen to make a decision where you're resonating with it, but you're also experiencing shadow cues at the same time, it is very possible that our ego, our mind, and our somatic cues, based on what we're experiencing in reactivity, may pull us away from making the very decision we need to make to push us forward into who we are. There are many examples of how this might occur, but this involves usually our value virtue system and our drives. And the reason for that is because those are defined by us in relation to who we are and what we stand for, as we well know. But making decisions or not, based on a place of avoidance, in this case happens to involve us in identity erosion. Because what happens is you're either not choosing to make a decision using boundaries as a scapegoat, you're using it simply as a means to avoid what's happening, you're using it as a fear-based mongering piece, and you're not making a decision just simply by making excuses or avoiding it, or sometimes lashing out, basically saying that you won't do something. Those are the very moments that you actually need to make a decision, because those are the ones that will push you forward in identity coherence. We call these in the Resonance core framework thresholds, where your identity is about to collapse. You're worried about what is going to happen when you make a decision. They can be micro decisions or even macro decisions, depending on what happens in your life, but they all share the exact same foundational situation. They test you on who you are, because you're then going to experience that you're getting fearful of something when you realize that that decision is actually asking you, is this who you are? And based on that threshold, it's going to say, hey, put your money where your mouth is. And if you give into avoidance, if you decide to use that process, especially when other people are involved, you're going to appear aloof. You're going to appear like you're just built on sandy ground. You don't have a strong foundation in who you are. And that's the problem with those, and also the scary part, let's be honest, because we often use self-preservation from our beloved ego to being able to say, no, I'm not going to do this, and here's why. I just want to protect myself. I know I'm doing the right thing. Oh, and by the way, this is a personal boundary of mine, and here's why. Avoidance erodes our integrity when we do that. And the problem is now, as you're probably aware with all the things we've been talking about in this episode and the resonant identity, you're asked to make actions that are uncomfortable. You are asked to go out of your comfort zone in order to being able to make a shift. When you want to change into who you want to become, when you want to become a better person, and when you want to elicit change. When those decisions happen, they're not from a place of personal boundaries. They're not from a place of any type of enjoying or saving your energy wells. They're not from a place of vision. They are not from a place of direction. They are from a place of erosion, of distortion. They are a place involving dissonance. And unfortunately, when we set those false boundaries, it may feel protective, and also it will feel right because, again, of what happens when we experience those emotions, those uncomfortable emotions, the things that make us go worry, the things that cause us chest tightening and tunnel vision and all those things. Those very moments are really going to test you. And so we need to understand that when those happen, we need to ensure that we are setting our correct boundaries and always looking at those in our journaling and DII scores, while also recognizing our shadow cues. And when we start to see our DII scores go down and those shadow cues start showing up, we then need to ask ourselves why. Because also, let's be honest here, we're not 100% going to get those decisions correct. Again, we always say it, but we just want to reiterate it here. Yes, we want to do the best we can, but we're human. Let's give ourselves some slack and some grace, and other people too. We're doing the best we can. But when we start to document those things in our journal, just like the drive propulsion loop, just like renegotiating and working in toward making those MVDs again, it's the same exact principle. We recognize that we experienced an avoidant circumstance. We made a decision by not making a decision, essentially, and avoiding the very thing that would actually push us toward who we want to become. But that's only one of those circumstances. You will have more of them that come down. They always do. Life just isn't simply defined by that one time you failed. And I wouldn't even call it failure. I call them learning experiences because that's what we're meant to do as humans. Instead, we write down what happened. We explain what happened in our shadow cues and our narratives. We start to understand the judgments that came up with that told us that we should have avoided that decision. And then we look at it through a data-driven decision-making lens, understanding, wait a minute, why was this an actual aligned decision? What would have happened if I made that decision? And so on. And that's what avoidance does. Because if we don't actually look at things through that data-driven lens, we then start to just simply allow our identity to erode. Identity coherence just can't happen anymore, nor can identity alignment, because now you're making decisions from reactivity, from agreeance, from lashing out, low EQ, whatever the case may be. And if that's a consistent pattern, eventually you experience what's called identity collapse. And we talked about it before, but it's that moment where really your identity has no longer become a priority for you. You're now just simply going back and making decisions based on your past reality, the things that feel comfortable, the things that you've always known yourself to be, which are shrouded in distortion. Those things that just, once you make those simple decisions that just erode who you are, you have no choice, no chance of being able to make valid decisions because you're not being authentic with who you are. And we must avoid this at all costs. And that's what the importance of boundaries are set that are shrouded in truth, and then understanding where our avoidance patterns happen so that when they come up again, we know to look at them from a data-driven lens and finding the best way forward by actively making a decision toward our identity. Because the thing is, both of them can feel like we're pulling away in this case. And this is the other tricky part about boundaries and avoidance. Both of them do the same thing, if you think about it. Because what we're doing in that case is we're just choosing not to make a decision for a specific reason. But the difference in the choice is what makes the difference here. If you are making a choice not to make a choice based on your identity coherence, that is known as a personal boundary. That is something that is shrouded in your truth and your creative truth. Because you know that if you make that decision, it itself is going to be a source of identity erosion because it goes against who you are. But conversely, that's what avoidant decisions look like if you're making a decision that actually would be aligned, but you're making it out of fear or distortion or agreeance. That's the difference between these cases. A boundary is a presence with structure, and an avoidance is an absence with justification. When you have structure around who you are and what you stand for, you're making those decisions by not choosing to do what you're doing because that decision would very much erode who you are, because you know what your boundaries are and they are established in your identity alignment. But avoidance is where you just look at it and you justify why you're not making that decision. You're going through self-preservation. You're going through biases like confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. And then you're standing by that decision of avoidance by justifying it to yourself, constantly rationalizing why you shouldn't do this, why you need to make sure that you stay safe, ensuring that other people stay safe around you, and so on. While then what happens is you're at the cost of your own identity and your own authenticity. And that's the difference between the two. So it's easy to confuse the two because you're basically doing the same thing, but it's your actual intention that matters. Is it rooted in your identity or not? And that's the difference. And if you don't know the difference, which does happen sometimes, maybe you hit a blind spot in your vast unknown, maybe it's just something you've never really had to question before, you can even take time to just look at it and say, I'm not sure if I should make this decision yet. Unless, of course, it's crucial, then, you have other things you need to look at. But if it's something that you can pause a little bit about, you can then look at it again from a data-driven lens, like we always do, and ask yourself those questions. The interpretive hygiene, the triad. Does this decision make sense? Does it resonate with who I am? Is it in line with my personal guardrails and also is within my boundaries so that way it is a good decision? Will the decision actually impact the way that I want it to do? And why not, or why? All of those decisions for data, once you understand it, can then tell you, oh, this is definitely something I should not do, and here's why. Because you've then been able to say, that it goes against who you are, or the opposite, which is if you recognize that it is identity fulfilling, you make that decision. So keep that in mind because we're now going to be talking about a little bit what you're going to be experiencing, not just simply in terms of the threshold it processes, not just in terms of what you need to do, but also how it feels, what you're thinking, and what we need to do next to ensure that we do not accidentally avoid decisions that would help us become who we are. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with Terence Waters. We'll be right back. This is The Resonant Identity, and I'm Terence Waters. Welcome back. So now let's start to understand a little bit more about what happens in the body, what understands and how the body itself recognizes that maybe something is off. This we call, in the Resonance Core framework, embodied awareness, but also what is called somatic discipline. We use somatic discipline a little bit more as we talk about the outward reach when we're starting to make decisions with other people involved in us. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. But this is actually something that now applies to your boundaries and avoidance practices because usually these situations happen under pressure. They happen when when all of a sudden you start noticing that you do believe in something and you do know who you are, but your body and your cues are starting to fire and you may or may not know why. So again, those are just those shadow cues that we've been talking about pretty much since the beginning. And we don't need to stress those like far. But I do need to give you a little bit more detail into understanding what somatic discipline means, because it's just more than just simply being aware of your cues, like embodied awareness tells us to do. That is part of it. But somatic discipline requires us to say that we look at our cues and our narratives as data points. So we've already been doing this practice pretty much up until this point, but we now have a name for it. And it is one of the core values of the Resonance Core framework. So what that means essentially is when you notice that you're being asked to make a decision, you're trying to understand what it is that you need to do in any situation with yourself, with other people, in your teams and leadership, whatever the case may be. Your body naturally starts to go through a threat response cycle if it doesn't know what to do, or if it's something that just it has not experienced yet. This happens automatically, as we know. It goes through without us being aware of it. It then signals to our body and our mind that we need to pay attention to something. And of course, because the mind does what it does, it then sends us our narratives and the things that don't align, the things that don't make sense. And then, of course, we're getting flooded with all of these hormones and all the stuff that we already know about. We've already talked about this at length. We don't need to go about it again. But that's really where your inflection point happens. This is the threshold moment that I talked about before. Somatic signals will start to show up everywhere. Your emotions, your narratives, your judgments, your cues, everything else. And in those moments, now we're going to talk about it specifically about boundaries and avoidance. So that's where we want to kind of bring it down here. But somatic discipline asks us specifically to notice when all of that is happening and not let it be so troublesome that we're not able to make a sound decision. Somatic discipline asks us to say, when we notice that these things are happening in our bodies and in our minds, it asks us to be vigilant in remaining grounded, not just simply being aware of them, but taking efforts to not simply fight them off, but use them as data. We'll talk about this more as we get into what's called the judgment and the data loop. But what you need to understand right now is that when you notice that happens, you need to ground yourself. Somatic discipline just simply asks us to say, hold your ground. You're okay. Nothing's harming you. Nervous system, you can calm down a little bit. But I appreciate you giving me the information here so I know what to pay attention to. And this is, of course, what we do when we normally experience our cues, our grounding techniques, the micro rituals, meditation, walking, doing whatever it is that we need to do to being aware of where all those cues are coming from, what they are, what they mean to us, all of those things, but from, again, a data-driven decision-making lens. The same exact things that we keep talking about. And I only laugh to myself because I hear it and I just say, the Resonance Core framework just builds on itself. This is what it does. You're literally going to be hearing these exact same things over and over and over and over. So it's just, you're just like, oh my gosh, Terence, I've heard this 25 different ways. Yes, there's a reason for it because it's rooted in our emotional intelligence and our ability to make data-driven decisions that will push us forward. And I keep reiterating this because we have to, because those moments, our window of choice starts to contract. We start understanding much more things about ourselves that are not part of really reality. We start understanding things that really just are not even relevant. And we have to say it constantly because these moments are the very moments that show us what we need to do. And in the terms of boundaries and avoidance, that's where we start to look at it from a data-driven lens and recognize, oh, I see why my cues are actually firing right now. It recognizes that this is uncomfortable. This is going against my ethical and moral code. This is going against my guardrails. I'm noticing that I just don't have the energy right now to make this valid decision. I recognize that this could be bad if I make a decision here. I recognize that this decision is it out of line with who I am and what I stand for. All of those things. And only a data-driven stance will help you do that. Because if you simply make decisions from your emotional state, your somatic state, without incorporating somatic discipline, you usually make decisions that lash out. They typically will simply bring you into distortion. And in this case, you're going to be making a decision based on avoidance. You usually do not make decisions correctly in an emotional state because it fails to account for nuance. That's why data-driven lenses are so important. Because we need to have all the facts. We need to understand the nuances of what's happening around us and in ourselves. And we have to reiterate it every single time because it is so crucial. Those moments test our very identity coherence. And in this case of a boundary, when we notice that the decision will literally go against who we are, we stop. We use creative truth. We look at the situation and the people that we're involved with. We express our truth, explaining why we're not going to make that decision and stand firm in it. And that takes some courage. I'm not saying you're going to get this one right immediately as well. Creative truth is its own little process, which we will get to later. But the thing is, the understanding that you have a boundary is something that you have personally set that you will never cross, regardless of the situation. And when you reach that moment and you know that it is resonant and rooted in who you are, you can say no. And you can give people very strong data as to why you are not. And because of that, we can use those or what are called engagement tools. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, a boundary is an engagement tool? What does that mean? Especially when we're selling people who are not going to do something. Because here's the thing, boundaries, when they are relevant, when they are rooted in who we are in truth, when they are given in terms of authenticity and courage and confidence, they actually increase in connection with people, not decrease. There will be some people, of course, who will take offense to you not actually making that decision, but that's not on you. That's not your fault. As long as you know that you are resonant and truthful in the decision of not making a decision, that's not up to them. You are making a decision from identity coherence. And that is the most beautiful thing in the world. When you know you are aligned in a boundary, you never cross that boundary and you hold your ground. And the more you practice it, because it does take some time, you're going to then start to communicate to people who you are and what you will not stand for and what you will. That's the beauty here. And the ways that you can do this, of course, are through respective means. We talked about it a little bit before with David Allen Brown and what's called the human element. But somatic discipline, when we start looking into the outward reach, allows us also the ability to explain and talk to other people from a place of attunement, from a place of what is called empathy. Those things that allows us to being able to understand other people's emotions and states, while also being respectful of them so that we can communicate where we stand on things. So ways that you can do this when you realize you need to communicate a boundary as part of your creative truth. I need 24 hours to respond to this. Give me just a moment while I think it through. I can stay in this conversation if we slow the pace, but this is starting to make me a little uncomfortable. Let me understand a little bit more about the situation before I come to the final decision. I'm here and I'm definitely with you and I appreciate it, but I need some more clarity before we actually continue forward. This is something that I'm not comfortable making a decision on yet or a final say because I need more data. That's perfectly fine. That in and of itself is actually setting a boundary if you think about it, because you were telling the other person that you were not willing to make a decision out of urgency without fully understanding nuance. You are basically telling that person that you want to have all of the information in front of you first before you genuinely make a decision or not in terms of your boundaries and in terms of what you stand for and who you are. So basically, what the people understand that as, especially if they have high IQ and understand life, which most people usually do, they look at it and they say, oh, no, that's totally makes sense. And I appreciate you telling me that. Most people will really appreciate you being authentic and understanding while also standing root in who you are. Because in that case, that just simply shows you have integrity. You have a moral code that you do not wish to break. You also respect the other person's decisions and who they are, while also respecting your own identity coherence. And so every single boundary actually acts as a bridge to other people because they then start to understand who you are. And they also see that you're willing and able to actually stand up for what you believe in. And so it doesn't act as a wall. It does simply show the person this is what you stand for and are not willing to make that decision. But it actually shows people that you're authentic, that you're not just someone bullshitting actually what it is that they believe or you believe. And so if you think of it that way, a boundary does act as a wonderful way to engage people because it shows people that you are willing and able to stand up for your identity coherence and in turn, protect your own. You're listening to the Resonant Identity with Terence Waters. We'll be right back. You're listening to the Resonant Identity with Terence Waters. Welcome back. So now we've talked about how boundaries, when they are rooted in who we are, truly give people an understanding about who we are and what we stand for. But now we need to look at the opposite coin. We need to understand what avoidance does when we use it too much. Because again, we make mistakes. People understand that. And as long as we own up to those mistakes, just to be clear before we go into this section, usually that own up allows people to understand that you still have integrity. That happens. This is just life, right? But here's the thing. You have another thing with what is called avoidance debt, was like what we call it, which basically says you have decided to avoid a decision for whatever reason, and you have communicated out to the people around you that you are avoiding a decision that otherwise would show personal alignment in who you are. That simply shows as what's called a future cost. It makes people start to question your judgment. It makes people think that you are aloof. It makes people look at that you're not simply resolved in any sort of information. And what that does, especially in crucial decisions, as you start understanding things about who you are, making decisions in projects, part of your relationships, leadership, whatever, you then start to be looked at as someone who just can't be depended on for valid information. People won't necessarily tell this to you to your face. That's kind of the hard thing here. It's something I had to learn myself as I was starting to understand this while doing corporate world. When you start making decisions from lashing out, from emotions, or when you simply just avoid situations altogether, people are not going to come to you for advice. They're not going to ask you to try to make decisions or be part of projects because they just look at you as aloof. They don't really see that you're willing to engage with anything. And it just seems like all you're going to be doing is just avoiding everything or the things that you've done in the past because that's what you have done in the past. Remember that other people also have their own vast unknowns. They have their own cues, their own ideas of who you are, their narratives, and so forth. And we don't want to feed their subconscious with bullshit that actually is not part of who we are. Because unfortunately, the body keeps the score and the mind remembers all of those things. And what will happen is that same time again, when you were being asked to complete a deadline, you're being asked to interview this other person, you may be considered for that job role, whatever the case may be, people remember your reputation. People remember the way that you have made actions. And if you constantly avoid things by using judgment, by using narratives, by simply saying that you are putting up a personal boundary, whatever the reason or justification might be, your rationalizations literally show who you are. And they are a shrouded point of actually who you are because they are shrouded in a distorted view. The problem is your actions are not matching who you are. Your actions are showing something else. And when you avoid those cases, people, unfortunately, will pass you by. That's just how life works. If you're wanting to transform, if you're wanting to elicit change, working through those things that will actually make you a better person, you must ensure that you take those decisions that are uncomfortable, especially when you don't know what you're doing. because you're going to make mistakes, but you're at least showing people that you have the tendency and the aptitude to at least try, to do the best that you can. Learning situations, recognizing you're going to make mistakes, asking questions, working through mentors, whatever the case you may be, because you do not want to communicate to people a false identity of who you are, when in fact that is no way indicative of who you are. Because it then starts to show people, what does this matter? Who is this random person? Why did we bring them on our team? It also works in your relationships as well. When you start making decisions that just seem to go back and forth, and then also avoiding things or simply just not doing things out of whatever reason, your relationships and your friendships and your family and your spouse and your kids will show the exact same circumstance, because they'll start reading you in a way that doesn't communicate who you are, and they will start to question your judgment. This is just naturally how it works, because the nervous system fires, the mind starts to bring up narratives, and those narratives, if they're not matching, you're going to get passed. And we do not want that to happen, especially when we need to make decisions that land with the people that help us get what we want. And that's why we need to ensure that we set our boundaries and our avoidance circumstances correctly, understanding what an actual boundary is shrouded in who we are, while recognizing when we are avoiding decisions that otherwise would push forward identity coherence. So we need to understand what's called the architecture of healthy engagement as we start to understand boundaries and avoidance, because we want to design our boundaries just like we do our guardrails, with structural support, aligned with our identity, resonant in who we are, understanding and within our guardrails, aligned with our value, virtue, and drive system, and so on. And in order to do that, we need to do so through 3 specific structural supports: clarity, which says, what type of boundary do I need? Consistency, how do I actually take that boundary and uphold it? And compassion, how do we actually communicate it when we need to tell someone, hey, I'm not okay with doing this act and I have a boundary here? Because what this does, clarity, of course, is what we strive for in our decision-making processes. This is the data-driven decision-making lens in line with our identity, our interpretive hygiene, and the triad. And the consistency is what communicates out to the world who we are. It allows us to being able to say, anytime we approach this specific boundary that we know is aligned, we have that consistency in saying no and why, because we give people the reasons for why we are not doing something. But then most importantly, we approach through the outward reach, compassion, which is showing people not just simply be abrasive in why we're not doing something, lashing out, showing your own shadow cues or whatever. You need to communicate it in a way that is respectful of the other person's needs. You need to show people an understanding why this is a boundary of yours, while also being very attuned to their own cues. Again, we're going to get into this much stronger as we go through the outward reach. I'm really excited to get to that section, because then that's where you're going to be able to show your identity to other people and the tools necessary to make that happen. But these 3 specific pillars are how you maintain your long-term relational sustainability in every single facet of your life: yourself, your family, your kids, your relationships, your friendships, your religious groups, your political groups, your volunteer work, all of it. All of these things show people that you have a sense of integrity of who you are. It shows people that you have a limit of things that you can actually do. And it shows people that you actually protect the person of who you are, specifically around all the boundaries that you yourself have defined. And of course, that also means that we have to look at those boundaries from time to time. Just like we do our MVDs, our drives, our value virtue system, our guardrails, whatever, boundaries are no different. When we notice that we needed a boundary, we need to ensure that that boundary is still viable. So sometimes when we make those decisions that actually could have helped us, but all of a sudden see that we made a decision that actually crossed a boundary, but then we see that it actually benefited us, that's a disalignment. Because if a boundary is actually preventing us from being able to make a decision, we need to understand what that is. Because if that decision, even if the boundary was well-intentioned, if it's preventing us from identity coherence, we need to do the exact same thing, evaluating it through a feedback loop, a data loop. Wait a minute, this boundary is pushing me away from what it is that I specifically need to do to become who I want to become. Where is the disconnect there? What am I missing here? What are the things that actually do not make sense as part of logos? It may resonate with me, but why all of a sudden is it not pushing me toward who I need to become? What's happening where I feel like it's aligned with myself, but it actually is aligned? Where am I seeing that disconnect? And then you can start to understand trends in your journaling and your DII scores. When those situations happen again and again, you'll start to see a pattern of what's happening and what you're documenting, so that then you can say, oh, this actually is what the boundary is. It should be this, not this. Or this boundary no longer serves me, so I'm going to completely get rid of it because it doesn't even make sense anymore. I'm actually okay making this decision because XYZ. Again, we stress it all the time, but this is what data-driven decision making does. When you are able to logically, ethically, morally, and intuitively make decisions, it then shows you where those holes occur so that you can make those small adjustments, just like we do our drives and everything else. And this allows us the ability to being able to understand, ensuring that our boundaries are set and aligned with who we are. Now, what I want to do before we get to the 7-day challenge and the break is talk to you about our first meta value in the Resonance core framework that is aligned in your boundaries and avoidance. And this is called legacy resonance. So up to this point, we've been talking about resonance in understanding alignment, in understanding who we are, when our cues, our narratives, and ourselves, and also our external reach are in alignment in one with another. And they also are rooted and bounded properly in our guardrails. Because now what we do is legacy resonance is actually everything that encompasses that entire process. Because legacy resonance runs over it all, which again, why would we call it the resonant identity if we weren't? Resonance is at the heart of the Resonance core framework, which is what this podcast is built from. And legacy resonance is that first, what we call meta value. Now, what's the difference? So a core value, think about it in terms of value virtue systems. We use that as a value that we have chosen to adopt. We understand that resonance is an actual meta value, whereas embodied awareness and created truth and a lot of those others are values that we have now decided to take on to ourselves because we are now stewards of the Resonance core framework and the resonant identity. Whether or not you've realized it, you've actually been embodying 3 of them already. Embodied awareness, being aware of your cues, understanding what it is you want in your life and what you don't through modular precision, and then choosing to remain aligned through resilient alignment. Those 3 things are additional core values of the Resonance core framework, which, whether or not you define them, they're actual values that you have decided to become part of who you are. How do I know that? Because shouldn't the reason be obvious by now? You've chosen to listen to 16 episodes of this podcast, and I know you've been doing some of these already, whether or not you're aware of it. And even if you haven't been doing them correctly or making mistakes, the fact is you're doing them. You're choosing to listen to this podcast because it resonates with you. You're choosing to do these decisions, to embody your embodied awareness, to understand more about yourself, to improve your decision-making processes. You wouldn't be listening to 16 episodes if you didn't, right? I mean, hey, I guess if that's not what you're doing, you're just simply enjoying the resonance, hey, I'm cool with that too. You're welcome to listen as long as you want. But here's the thing, there's alignment here. You've been aligned this entire time because you have decided to listen to 16 episodes of this podcast and recognize that this is something you want to do, even if you haven't done anything yet. Because the thing is, you're listening to this. And you know what that is right there? That is legacy resonance. Because right now we're aligned. You're actually feeling good about the things that you're listening to here. And whether or not you have done anything, that's not the point here. The point is you have actively or even inactively chosen to listen to 16 episodes of a podcast that are giving you the clues and understanding simply from a place of resonance. Because our shared resonance from the Resonant core framework and Fluxline is now shared with you, my listener. That is what legacy resonance does. It is a long-term sustainability mechanism to being able to help people understand things about what you believe in and actually help them also embody it as part of who they are. Didn't think about that, did you? Because think about it for a minute. If I'm actually this person who's just simply talking into a mic, which by the way, I am, and now you're listening to all of these things and going, wait a minute, this is making sense to me. That's resonance, my dear. That is literally the embodiment of legacy resonance shared as shared resonance. That is what this podcast does. This is what my resonance core framework does. Because if a person is going to go and take the time and listening to an actual podcast, it means that they are deciding to embody that as part of who they are, whether or not they're aware of it, because they act as a long-term process that just simply embodies it because it's something you already innately align with. Whether or not it feels comfortable, whether or not you've been doing anything, whatever the case may be, you've been listening to this podcast because you realize that it's actually part of who you are. And those feelings of resonance, of just feeling good, if you want to look at it even just that way, you don't even have to think of it as resonance. Feeling good about something naturally is something you want to engage in. And then here's the exact opposite of that process: dissonance. Because if you have been experiencing dissonance in any way, shape, or form up to this point, you either fast forwarded through the podcast episode, you either just decided not to engage any further, whatever the case may be, or maybe you just listened to one episode and said, nope, which, by the way, that hasn't happened. You instead would have actually been saying, this is just not for me. And that's fine. And that's not to say that's a bad thing, but it's also to say that it just wasn't aligned in your current situation. And so because of that, you're not listening to this episode, to be frank. Now, I don't say that to be haughty. I also don't say that to kind of put myself on a shoebox or anything. It's more just to kind of prove a point, which is legacy resonance is literally what will drive you. And when you notice that you're not experiencing that resonance as part of a meta value and the resonance core framework in your life, that's where you then understand a boundary needs to be put here. I don't feel comfortable with this. This is not something I'm going to do. I'm setting a boundary here, especially when you're much more in tune with your cues and your narratives as part of somatic discipline, because it shows you that you are actually willing to not make decisions that tarnish your actual identity or what you stand for. Legacy resonance also works the opposite way. That's basically what we're trying to say here. Not just simply to say that, yes, we're listening to this podcast and wow, we're feeling resonant about it, but the fact is you have felt resonance here, where the exact opposite would have occurred if you were feeling dissonance, because you then would have realized this podcast is not for me. I don't need to listen to it anymore. This is just not really something I'm aligning with. No harm, no foul. That just simply means that you were also engaging in your own resonance because you recognize that you were not resonant with this material. That's how that works. Alignment is simply alignment. When you feel that alignment deep within you and you understand that the decisions that you are making are in alignment with it, that are within your guardrails and your personal boundaries, you engage with it because it makes you feel good. Your EROI scores are up, your DII scores are up, all of it. And the exact opposite occurs. When you notice that you're not feeling that resonance, you need to understand why. And most of the time, it's because there's misalignment, which says that you need to set a boundary. And in that case, you set a boundary, as long as it's rooted in who you are and what you stand for. And then from there, you're able to establish with what's called your relational legacy, which is again the same things that we talked about before. How people see you, how people know how dependable you are, how aloof people think you are because you keep avoiding things, all the above. And each and every single decision that you make from here on out, you now know has an impact on other people, whether for your positive circumstances and light, or shadow or distortion situations based on inaction or the wrong decisions, which sometimes happens. But it's up to you to understand which is which. And when you notice that you're misaligned in either one of those type of decisions and want to make up, you then make amends. You take effort to correct those mistakes, own up to your mistakes, and recognize that you're not perfect, giving yourself grace and so on. Because the question you want to ask yourself as part of legacy resonance, your boundaries, your avoidance, your identity coherence, what does my presence build over time? And what do I want it to build over time? Because most of the circumstance that I would actually argue, and I'm probably going to stand by this one, you want to build a legacy. You want people to remember you. You want to push something out there that no one else has ever done. You want to build a life for yourself and your kids and your spouse and your family and your friends that show that you give a fuck. Forgive my French, but it's true. That's exactly what the point is. When you walk into a room, how do you want people to remember you by? Why are they going to remember you that way? And what can you do to influence the way that they see you so that that way, when you are starting to make more aligned decisions, that they include you in those decisions? And the way to do that is through legacy resonance as part of the resonance core framework, aligned with your boundaries, your value virtue system, and your guardrails to ensure that you do not enact actions that are outside of your control. You're listening to the Resonance Core Framework with Terence Waters. We'll be right back. This is the Resonant Identity, and this is Terence Waters. Welcome back. And this time I do say that because I kind of gave you something that probably made you think a little bit. And that's actually what the whole point. This is not to tell you that you are being manipulated, that you are being changed, or anything like that. It's to tell you that you're feeling alignment. And I love that about that. That's a wonderful thing to experience. Because if we're aligned, that actually means that you want to make a difference in the world. And that's what I want to help you do. That's really what this whole purpose is about. The Resonance Core Framework showing you the best ways to make your decisions to transform. And eventually the Resonance Core Framework, which is going to show you all of those tools in a book that'll be coming to show you how to live a resonant life through legacy resonance. So yeah, you're right where you need to be. And I'm glad you're here. That's all it is. I don't really care about anything else. That's why I love this podcast stuff, because it gives me a voice and it allows me to be able to speak to those people like you who want to make a difference in their life. So give yourself a pat on the back. You really should be really proud of yourself, just saying, hey, this is something that I can do. And even if you haven't done anything yet, don't feel bad. Do whatever it is you need to do to start embodying anything that allows you to being able to move forward. That's what your MBDs, your cues, and all that fun stuff are for. So yeah, again, I thank you for being my listener, because we're pretty awesome here. And I hope you keep staying because we have a lot more to go for. So now, on that note, like we always do, let's talk about the 7-day challenge, shall we? So basically, we want to being able to understand our boundaries and our avoidance this week. We need to reset our understanding of both of them, because one thing that we may set as a boundary may or may not be us simply shrouding our understanding of ourselves in distortion. And the exact opposite, like we mentioned, which is if you're avoiding something that you think is a personal boundary, which actually would be pushing you forward, that also is taking you away from being able to achieve your identity cohesion, your identity coherence, and your identity transformation. So we're going to build structural boundaries that preserve our clarity and resonance while getting rid of those avoidant actions that we're doing that erode our integrity and our identity. And we're going to be doing this over several days, just like we normally do. And again, you can find all this information in the companion article and also the 7-day challenge article on our website, theresonantidentity.com. You can find all this information by searching TRI016. So the first thing that we want to do on day one is an awareness pattern, which is naming the avoidance pattern. Because the thing is, we can't know specifically what we're actually avoiding unless we're aware of them. So you might be asking, how do we do that? So what you're going to do is you're going to take on the first day a 10-minute micro ritual. Now remember what those are, which is basically saying, setting an intention within your body to calm down your cues, to make yourself feel safe, to not overload your system as you're about to perform a drive. Because in this case, it does expend a little bit of energy, but if you can center yourself and calm your cues, it actually makes it much easier for you to being able to enact that drive or MBD. So we take the micro ritual and we bring ourselves back to the present moment. A couple minutes of breathing, diaphragmatic breathing, taking a walk if you need to, whatever the case may be. Whatever intention that you set to let your body and your mind know, hey, I want to make an action. Don't freak out about it. Just stick with me for a little while. And then when you're ready, you're then going to identify just one situation that you've been avoiding. Anything in life. It could be a conversation, a decision that you're about to make, a truth that you've had a hard time accepting, maybe a boundary that you haven't set yet, anything that actually feels resonant with you in that moment. Again, we're doing just a small win so that way we can look into the situation in understanding where that avoidance is actually occurring and the way that we can look into how can we work through it. And the reflection prompt that you can either write down in your journal or write down on a piece of paper, journal it, it's much easier. What am I protecting myself from? And what is this avoidance costing me? What's going to happen is you're going to then start to experience those cues and narratives in the moment as you ask that question. That's the point, because you're now looking at things through a data-driven decision-making lens. You're inviting your body and your mind to tell you what's wrong with it, to tell you what's going and scaring it, overwhelming it, what feels so heavy about it. So that way you can start to write down those shadow cues and recognize that those are the sources of your distortion, and that your narratives then start to show up a little bit, which also are things that you can explore at another time. But in this instance, we're simply applying them to your boundaries and this avoidance, so that way we can start to look at how we can turn the table a little bit. And you do that, of course, through your patterning and your somatic signals, which is looking into things of saying, oh, I don't think I'm actually going to make this decision today. Maybe I'll wait till tomorrow. No, that doesn't feel right. I think I'm just going to go ahead and say this isn't something I'm going to embody. If that person said that I need to make this deadline tomorrow and I have to give a presentation on it, but I'm not really that type of a person. I really do need to be more careful about keeping my head down, even though I want to become yada, yada, yada. It's those type of little justifications that your mind is usually the one that tells you, especially your ego, because doesn't our ego love us so much? Not really. But in those cases, you usually start to notice those patterns around a very specific situation. And so day one is helping us identify what those are in this micro ritual. Then what I'm going to have you do is do a clarity exercise by defining a boundary that you need. Because what this boundary will do is in alignment with the avoidance that you've experiencing as well. Because what you're going to do is say, oh, I can set a boundary to being able to say, I want to stay present while also not overloading my system. So maybe it means that I only need to do a little bit of this process or prepare for it in some way or find a way to being able to define it a little bit smaller so that it doesn't overwhelm my system. And it's the exact same process just like an MVD. So if you're noticing the parallelism, that's why. A boundary is rooted in who you are. A boundary is rooted in your guardrails and your value virtue system. You're making it very specific and actionable, but is aligned with your avoidance strategy so that way, when we start to change the tide, we're able to still adhere to that boundary that we think we need, but we're also able to kind of open the gate a little bit, opening that door of the avoidance so that we can start to pass through that door. Make sure that you're, of course, doing the right things. Feel the spine as your boundary, making sure that you're sitting upright, feeling grounded, breathing techniques, your cues are calm, things like that when you're doing this. And then I want you to state the boundary safely. Draft the exact sentence that you would use to communicate your boundary to yourself and others. You don't have to send it yet to anyone. You don't need to do this with anything at this point. You just need to write down what it is. And then here's a couple of different options that you could use. I'm here, but I need some clarity. I could stay in this conversation, but I need you to slow it down. Explain to me what's going on here. I need 24 hours in order to be able to respond to this thoughtfully. I realize that we're having some tension here, but if you could maybe bring things down a little bit and recognize that I'm not trying to hurt you, I'm just trying to understand the situation so we can make a right decision. That's an easy boundary. It doesn't have to be a hard stop. It can easily be something that has a little bit of respect, because remember the 3 C's: clarity, compassion, and consistency, to ensuring that you're able to explain that to other people correctly. Always relax your jaw. Ensure that you're in a present moment. You're still going to be doing the micro rituals as part of this process and so on. And then what you want to do is practice that micro boundary, pausing before you respond, asking for clarification just so that way you're practicing pushing that boundary you've set, taking a 5-minute reset before you continue a conversation, whatever the case may be. You're showing other people that you do have a boundary and need to protect your identity and your energy well. You are showing people that boundary in a respectful way while communicating it also in a clarity-based focus. Because if you're simply still allowing the situation to occur, even though you've set this boundary, that boundary means nothing. It's not going to do you any good. You have to also stand your ground with it through creative truth. That's not the easiest thing to do, and you may experience some problems doing that, but do so in a very, very simple, understanding way. We talk about the outward reach later, but an easy way for you to be able to do that is saying, if I were having to deliver this information to myself, what would I want to know about it? How would I want to be told? What would be the most smooth way to do so while respecting the other person's point of view, while also allowing myself to stand my ground? Just ensuring that you communicate it in a very consistent, communicative way, respecting other people's integrity and their respect. And then what you want to do is confront that avoidance that you have been avoiding. The actual situation that makes you think you just can't do what you're supposed to do. That hard conversation. The deadline that it just keeps getting pushed further and further and further. Whatever the case may be, you need to find the best way to push your boundary out, because that boundary is not a valid boundary. It is you avoiding the situation out of fear. I had to do this recently while I've been building a lot of these things for my book, because I've been pushing out this whole thing I need to do, which is building out some of the training materials, building out the websites, doing something that I just don't know how to do. And unfortunately, yes, I have been doing this for a while because I've been just simply avoiding it and pushing it down the road. But now that the manuscript is pretty much finished, and now I'm in production of my book, it's kind of crazy to think, but that's where I am. I now realize that that's become a priority. And even though I have no idea what the hell I was doing, I recognize that I just needed to dive in. I'm a one-man army. How else am I going to figure this out? It's not going to get done on its own, right? So I looked at it more and saying, how can I make this understood while also pushing out that little bit of fear while keeping myself grounded? And I recognized that I already had all the tools that I needed to do. I just had to set myself into a micro ritual of performing some of the actions over a small period of time. I gave myself 15 minutes, started understanding a few things, and eventually it turned into about 6 hours, where about 90% of the work got done. That's the crazy part about it. It's always those simple things of just start. And then eventually you just naturally start to continue doing what you're doing, just because your body then recognizes, oh, this is fine. I'm not worrying about anything. I'm not going to break anything. This is actually aligned with what I want to do. And I know what I need to do next instinctively. It's funny how I still get some of those things even years from now, like when I've been working so long in the industry, like with my personal training and all the work I've been doing, but you still get that fear, right? It's just because of how our past echoes work and our cues and our narratives. But the more that you start to show yourself that you're actually in a safe place, no one's here to harm you, you are allowed to have boundaries and so on, you can make those decisions very small. You can show people still that you do have boundaries while being respectful of their own situation. In using those examples, give us 24 hours. Let's calm down a little bit. Can we go take a walk? Whatever makes sense for you. And then finally, what I want you to do is to build your boundary architecture by aligning your actions with your boundary. You need to look into understanding, what do I need to do to ensure that I am consistent in applying my boundary? And asking yourself through a reflection prompt in your journal on what to do with this case. And here's what that is. What part of me resists holding this boundary? What part of me wants to actually push up an invalid boundary? And why? It's looking at those things through a data-driven lens to start to ask a little bit more interpretive questions. Maybe just understanding a little bit more about yourself. You're not judging yourself. You're not simply taking like a bad rep or anything on who you are. You're just being curious, which is what data-driven decision-making is anyway. Giving yourself that permission to look into what's happening in your life and what you're feeling in that moment so that you can start to uncover a little bit more about yourself, which then usually leads you down a pathway of some other things that you haven't really thought about. And that's the fun part about this whole process, is the vast unknown will shed a lot of light for you on that. And then when you're able to set that boundary, ensuring that you continually align with it and make actions that still push you, so in that way you do not cross that boundary, you then look into, how do you ensure that you have that statement of long-term relational legacy? Writing a short statement that describes how you want to show up in relationships moving forward. And here's my example. I engage with people with clarity and understanding and curiosity. I stay present with the structure of what's happening in my life. I communicate my needs early, effectively, but firmly, taking all of those actions as close to who I am as possible. And I choose resonance and alignment over avoidance and distortion. It's really that simple. That even could be your own. Like, it literally talks about everything that's part of the resonance core framework. But you can adopt it to whatever makes sense for you. And what I do, I posted as a sign on my wall. I wrote it out, printed it, and literally taped it to my mirror. And I read a lot of these things every single day. My value virtue system, my drives, the things that I want to accomplish in life. It just is that little bit of more understanding and awareness for your vast unknown to remind yourself and it what you stand for and why. And when you do that, you eventually build that presence over time because then your body recognizes that you're in a safe place, that you're trying to protect it. You're giving yourself permission to not overexpend your energy wells, protecting what it is that you need while also expending it on the right things. And the way that you can do that is by ensuring that you have those boundaries set properly, ensuring that you're communicating those boundaries and standing by them, while also recognizing when you want to shy away. And that just comes down to, again, our core values of embodied awareness and somatic discipline, while also choosing for yourself what you want and what you don't through modular precision. So in closing, I'll just simply say this. When we're trying to understand our boundaries and our avoidance, we need to really use reflection and our journaling techniques to identify when we need a boundary, when we also are setting boundaries that are too rigid, and also when we are avoiding situations, so that way the decisions that we choose not to make are routed in who we are, not in distortion. And our reflective techniques on our journaling help us do that. The DII scores, understanding our cues, and looking for patterns as we start to make our journaling techniques. So things that you can think about that I'll just go ahead and leave you with are these 3 questions. Where am I using avoidance disguised as a boundary? Where can I architect a boundary that protects my resonance? And what structure do I need to stay engaged with integrity, in alignment with the 3 pillars of clarity, compassion, and consistency? And how do I ensure that when I do set these boundaries that I remain loyal and integrous with myself to ensure that I'm protecting my identity with who I want to become and enacting my drive system to help me get there? And with that, we'll close this episode. As always, my good listener, thanks for listening. Please share this with anyone that you care about and resonate with. And also for our purposes, please feel free to subscribe, review, and like this on your favorite podcast service and YouTube, because it helps us get the word out. It ensures that other people are able to share in this resonance. You can find the Resonant Identity on Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can check out the show notes to find us on social media, Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. You can also visit us and find all information about our articles, details about all the episodes, 7-day challenges, and demos at theresonantidentity.com. Please also feel free to email us. We'll be happy to read some of your stories on the air and also on our website. You can email us at mail@theresonantidentity.com. This podcast is governed by FluxLine's terms of use policy, responsible AI usage policy, and others, which can be found in the show notes and on our website at theresonantidentity.com. And say it with me, folks. Have fun, be safe, know who you are and what you stand for, and make choices aligned with your true and chosen identity. Stay safe out there. Goodbye for now. Live long and prosper.